Russia has a reputation. Gulags. The KGB. Winters that kill the unprepared in hours. A president who rides horses shirtless through landscapes that have tried to erase every living thing inside them for most of recorded history. It is, by almost any modern measure, one of the harder places on Earth to exist. And it has never once, in all of recorded human history, come close to how dangerous it actually was. Because 255 million years ago, before there were humans, before there was a single mammal walking this planet, Russia was already perfecting the art of killing everything inside its borders. It had built the first saber-toothed predator in the history of life on Earth. It had armored river monsters disguised as amphibians. It had a creature the size of a Siberian tiger that may have delivered venom through its bite. And underneath all of it, in absolute silence, it was building the single most destructive weapon this planet has ever produced, one that would not just end Russia's reign of terror, but very nearly end everything, everywhere, for every species alive. This is the story of the last apex predator to rule that world before it ended. We will call him Carvo. He did not have a name. No Inostrancevia ever needed one. But for the next several minutes, you are going to know exactly what it felt like to be the most dangerous animal on the planet, in the 4 million years before the planet stopped caring. Carvo was born on a flood plain that would one day sit beneath the soil of central Siberia, in a world that looked nothing like the one you know. This was the late Permian, specifically the Lopinian stage, occurring between 259 and 251 million years ago. To put that in perspective, that span of time is so vast that you could fast forward 100 million years from its end and still have to wait another 80 million years before the first Tyrannosaurus rex ever existed. Russia, at this point, was not Russia. It was not even one piece of land. Siberia and what would become European Russia were two separate landmasses, isolated from each other by a shallow inland sea, and the entire arrangement sat inside the supercontinent Pangaea, a single vast landmass containing almost the entire surface area of the modern world's continents fused together. If you had been dropped into Carvo's world with a compass and a map, both would have been useless. The geography would not exist again for 250 million years. And here is the detail that should unsettle you before we go any further. Siberia, in Carvo's lifetime, was one of the most isolated places on the entire planet. Not isolated like a remote modern village is isolated. Isolated like a sealed room. To the west, a shallow sea separating Siberia from Europe. To the south and west further still, the Ural Mountains, still standing today, creating a rain shadow that made Siberia drier than it had any geological right to be. And if you somehow crossed both of those barriers, you would run directly into the central Pangaean Mountains, a mountain range comparable in average height to the modern Himalayas, but stretching for a considerably greater distance, the torn and scattered remnants of which still exist today as the Appalachians, the Atlas Mountains, the Bohemian Massif, and the Massif Central. One mountain range. For modern continents now carry pieces of it. There was no leaving Carvo's world. There was only learning to survive inside it. The climate, strangely, was the one mercy this isolated prison offered. Russia's high latitude, even then, even on a wildly different Pangaea, kept it from the catastrophic heat baking the supercontinent's interior, where desert stretched farther than any desert on Earth today. Siberia supported genuine temperate biomes, forests of Tatarina seed ferns, primitive conifers, ginkgo-like trees, threaded by wide braided rivers. It was survivable. That was the mercy. The curse was what the mercy allowed to live there. Carvo belonged to a dynasty called the Gorgonopsids, a name that translates roughly to Gorgon-faced, and the mythological reference is not an exaggeration. These were not mammals. They were not reptiles. They were therapsids, an evolutionary branch that sits as the direct ancestor, or the close cousin of the direct ancestor, of every mammal that has ever lived, including you. But nobody alive in the late Permian would have cared about that taxonomic detail. What they would have cared about was that the Gorgonopsids had built an empire across exactly two places on the entire planet, South Africa and Russia. Everywhere else, the climate was too punishing even for them. Which meant that in Carvo's world, Russia was run by not one species of apex predator, but several, Pravoslavlevia, Soroctonus, Biatkagorgon, Suchagorgon, and Nakhnitsa among them, each sharing the same fundamental architecture. For legs, a fully terrestrial existence, a semi-erect gait position somewhere between a crocodile sprawl and a wolf's upright stride, and a skull built around one devastating innovation. Elongated, blade-like canine teeth. Saber-teeth. Carvo's kind were not just successful predators. They were the first saber-toothed predators in the recorded history of life on this planet. Every saber-toothed cat that would ever stalk every ice age on every continent for the next 250 million years was, in the most literal evolutionary sense, walking in Carvo's footsteps. And unlike the saber-toothed cats that would come much later, animals believed to use their teeth in a single precise strike to the throat, Carvo's kind likely hunted with a crueler patience. The Gorgonopsid jaw was more reptilian, less precise, built for power rather than surgical accuracy. The strategy, paleontologists believe, was simple and horrifying: deliver one devastating bite with those oversized teeth, then withdraw. Wait. Watch the prey weaken from shock, from blood loss, from the catastrophic organ damage already done. And if it somehow found its feet again, deliver a second bite, and finish what the first one started. Survival, for anything Carvo's size ever touched, meant nothing. It only meant a longer death. But here is what almost nobody tells you about the Gorgonopsids: they were not all giants. The smallest of them, Biatkagorgon and Nakhnitsa, were genuinely small. Roughly corgi-sized. Nakhnitsa, in particular, is a contender for the tiniest Gorgonopsid ever discovered, with some individuals barely longer than a ruler. These were not the monsters of this story. Their prey was small vertebrates, large insects, scavenged scraps. A bite from one of these would have been survivable. Carvo was not one of these. Carvo was Inostrancevia alexandri, the largest Gorgonopsid that has ever been discovered, and by a considerable margin. Specimens recovered from Russian deposits measure up to 3 meters in length, with rare individuals reaching 3.5 meters and an estimated body mass of 400 kilograms, placing Carvo in the same size class as a modern polar bear, the largest land predator currently alive on Earth. But the polar bear comparison undersells him in one critical respect: Carvo's skull, despite his body being roughly equivalent in mass, was approximately 40% larger than a polar bear's. In the largest individuals, that skull was bigger than an entire human torso. Inside that skull, teeth comparable in proportional scale to those of a megalodon shark, a predator that would not exist for tens of millions of years, and that was, by body mass, over 100 times larger than Carvo. And Carvo's jaw could open to nearly 90 degrees, wide enough to deliver a bite that didn't just wound. It sank directly into vital organs, through flesh and muscle that belonged to prey animals that were themselves often massive and heavily armored. Carvo moved with a fluid efficiency that paleontologists believe made him the most agile predator in his entire ecosystem, closer to a lion's controlled power than a lumbering reptile's drag, and he hunted with a sense of smell sharp enough to track prey across the flood plain long before he ever saw it. If you had been dropped into late Permian Siberia with nothing but your own body and your modern human intelligence, there was exactly one piece of survival advice that would have actually helped you: avoid the rivers. Carvo, and every Gorgonopsid like him, concentrated their hunting around river ecosystems, the places where water drew every species in the food web into one predictable, exploitable location. The single richest resource in Carvo's world was also the single most lethal place to stand. And even that advice would only have delayed the inevitable. Because rivers were not the only threat in Carvo's Russia. They weren't even the only kind of monster. Sharing Carvo's flood plains was a second dynasty, younger and hungrier, the Therocephalians, beast heads, close evolutionary cousins of the Gorgonopsids, similarly built, but carrying more advanced anatomical features, larger temporal openings for more powerful jaw muscles, more sophisticated nasal architecture. They were, in essence, an upgrade still being tested by evolution. And in Russia, the dominant family among them, the Echidnognathidae, had already grown large and robust enough to directly challenge Carvo's kind for the same prey. One species among them, Mascarinus, hunted with a strategy disturbingly familiar to anyone who has watched a modern lion work, piercing the neck, holding the struggling prey down with teeth that were not just sharp but unusually thick enough to avoid the catastrophic tooth fractures that Carvo risked every time his more delicate saber teeth made contact with bone. And then there was Megalodon. A predator the size of a Siberian tiger, moving with the same controlled power, and carrying, within the very bone of its upper jaw, 3 small channels running from the nasal cavity along the roots of its canine teeth toward the tooth sockets. Researchers studying these channels believe they may have housed venom glands. If that interpretation holds, Megalodon was not only one of the oldest venomous tetrapods ever discovered. It may have been the largest venomous animal that has ever existed that wasn't a reptile. A creature the size and speed of a tiger. With a bite that might not have needed to kill you outright, because the venom would finish the job anyway. Carvo's empire on land was real, but it was never uncontested. It was a kingdom permanently under siege from a smaller, sharper, more advanced rival dynasty that was learning, with every generation, to do everything Carvo did, slightly better. And the land was the easy part. Here is the detail that should genuinely disturb you. If Carvo's land empire became too dangerous, the rivers offered no escape, because the rivers were not ruled by anything resembling a modern crocodile. Crocodilians did not yet exist. The rivers of Permian Russia were ruled by amphibians. Not the harmless, palm-sized amphibians you know. The Permian world had inherited the tail end of the Carboniferous period, the genuine golden age of amphibian dominance, an era that had produced creatures up to 9 meters long and nearly 2 tons in body mass. By Carvo's time, those true giants were gone. But their descendants remained, and among them, the Croniosuchids, nicknamed, accurately, the copycat crocs, had evolved a body plan almost identical in function to the crocodile design that wouldn't independently evolve again for tens of millions of years: long low bodies, powerful tails, elongated snouts, and an entire dorsal surface covered in interlocking bony armor plates called osteoderms. The largest of these, Bystroiena and Eurolurpedon, each reaching roughly 2.7 meters, were ambush predators capable of dragging prey far larger than themselves into the water and holding on with conical teeth designed specifically for gripping and dragging rather than cutting. And some of the smaller Croniosuchid species may have been capable of effective hunting on land as well as in the water, amphibious predators with all the patience of a crocodile and none of the limitations. There was no version of Carvo's world where staying near water was the safe choice and staying away from water was the dangerous one. Every choice was the dangerous choice. That was the entire design of the ecosystem. And underneath every single one of these animals, the saber-teeth, the venomous fangs, the armored river monsters, the planet itself was already building something far worse than any predator that had ever lived. Here is what nobody in Carvo's world could possibly have known. Beneath the soil he hunted across every single day of his life sat one of the largest reservoirs of magma this planet has ever produced, accumulated silently, invisibly, over a span of geological time that dwarfs anything in Carvo's 4-million-year reign. Modern geologists call the eventual product the Siberian Traps. And what it represents is the largest volcanic event in the recorded history of planet Earth. When it finally erupted, not in Carvo's lifetime, but in the lifetime of his descendants, for a million years after the moment we are describing, it would not be a single eruption. It would unfold in pulses across approximately 1 million years, ultimately releasing enough lava that, spread evenly, it would bury the entire continental United States under roughly 2 kilometers of solid rock. Fires would rage across landscapes that had taken hundreds of millions of years to develop. Smoke would blot out the sky across the entire planet, not just Siberia. And underneath that smoke, the temperature would first crash into a volcanic winter, sulfur aerosols reflecting sunlight back into space, plant life failing across every continent, before reversing entirely into runaway warming, as the carbon dioxide released by burning coal deposits and continuous volcanic outgassing accumulated faster than the planet's natural systems could absorb it. The ocean's chemistry would change with it. Carbon dioxide dissolving into seawater would drop the ocean's pH low enough to dissolve the shells of the microscopic organisms that anchor the entire marine food web. When researchers finally tallied the cost of what is now called the Great Dying, the number that emerged for the oceans was almost incomprehensible: approximately 96% of all marine species, gone. On land, the toll was scarcely less catastrophic: roughly 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species, erased from the fossil record entirely. The empire that Carvo ruled, every Gorgonopsid, every Therocephalian, every armored river monster, every venomous tiger-sized predator, would not survive what was coming. Not because something stronger arrived to replace them. Because the ground itself opened. Carvo himself almost certainly never saw the eruption begin. He lived and died in the 4-million-year window before it, at the absolute peak of his dynasty's power, ruling a flood plain he had no reason to believe would ever belong to anything else. That is, in its own way, the most unsettling fact in this entire story. The most dangerous animal in the most dangerous place on the planet had absolutely no capacity to know that the single greatest catastrophe in the history of life on Earth was already loading beneath his feet, with a timer that had started ticking millions of years before he was born. What survived him tells you everything about what actually matters when a world ends. It was not the strongest. It was not the largest. It was not the animal with the most terrifying teeth. The dominant survivor of the Great Dying on land was Lystrosaurus, a small, unremarkable, barrel-chested plant-eater roughly the size of a large dog, so adaptable and so undiscriminating in what it could eat that it came to represent an almost unbelievable 95% of all individual land vertebrates alive in the immediate aftermath of the extinction. An animal Carvo would have walked past without a second glance inherited the entire planet. And the descendants of a smaller, less dramatic reptile that shared Carvo's rivers, the early Archosaur Archosaurus rossicus, ancestor to every crocodile, every pterosaur, and eventually every dinosaur that would ever exist, survived where Carvo's entire dynasty did not. Within roughly 10 million years of the extinction, that lineage had produced the first true dinosaurs. Within 50 million years, dinosaurs ruled the planet with exactly the same totality that Carvo's kind once ruled Russia. The basalt is still there. 7 million cubic kilometers of it, much of it still lying directly beneath modern Siberia, visible today in road cuts and riverbank erosion across the region, the physical, geological signature of the worst event in the history of life on this planet. Written permanently into the rock of the same country that would one day produce gulags and a Cold War and a man who rides horses shirtless through landscapes that have always, in one way or another, been trying to kill everything inside them. Russia has always been this. The cruelty was never new. It only changed its teeth.